Right. The first thing that's important for you to remember is that as far as Wednesday's class is concerned, if I'm feeling better, then we'll absolutely on Wednesday meet in person. But again, I don't know how I'll feel. So by Tuesday afternoon, I will make an announcement on the course site and let you know whether you're supposed to, whether you can have class in person and online on Wednesday or not. So I'll let you know about that. The second important thing that I want to let you know, which I will also post an announcement about, is who the TA will be for your particular section. I'm still working with some admin stuff on that. As soon as I get that done and it's official, I'll let you know. And the reason I mention this is because once you have a TA, what you're going to do is that the class participation emails that you send me, you'll copy your TA to them because your TA is the one who's going to be marking that class participation. Okay. So that's just a couple of things. I also wanted to share some impressions with you based on your um, class participation emails that I've gotten so far. I'm really happy with the quality of the questions as well as the the contributions or the remarks that you made, sort of where you answered people's questions from within the class, or whether you've just made some comments based on whatever the lecture has said. And I'm really impressed with that, and I would really encourage you to keep this going because obviously I'm getting like 60 to 70 emails, so it's not possible for me to reply to each of you individually. But where I have tried, unfortunately, the IBA email wasn't working and all of those emails bounced back to me. So I'll resend them and I'll keep on replying as and when I can. But just in case if I don't respond, I just need you to know that doesn't mean I didn't get your email. So, just bear with me for a little bit. Of course, once you have a TA, they will respond to all of your emails. So that was another thing I wanted to clarify to you. And now I guess we're about 73 students, so we can begin. Okay, so where we left off in our last class was talking about the different ways to approach research in psychology. Now, in summary, we talked about observational studies, how those can be done in natural settings where you basically are not a participant at all in the research, and the people or the environment you're observing does not have any of you involved, in the sense that it's a completely naturally occurring environment and people are behaving or animals are behaving in their completely natural setting. On the other hand, you can do a case study, which is also kind of also does involve some form of observation usually. um, when you do a case study, you also get a lot of very wealthy detail about a particular aspect within a particular subgroup of the population, or whatever it is that you're trying to test, or whatever your hypothesis is. A case study can also be an exploratory study. So, similar to naturalistic observation, where you simply want to explore something to figure out what it is that you want to question specifically later. Now, when we talk about experimental research, in that case, then it's a very structured situation. An environment is created by the researcher, which is a controlled environment whereby the researcher wants to examine if I introduce Y, the independent variable, into the life of X, which is the dependent variable, how or what happens to X, right? And typically, the researcher makes a prediction about what they think Y will cause to happen, or what the result will be of introducing Y into the equation. And then the rest of the experiment and the how Y is brought in is completely designed around testing that particular hypothesis or that prediction about what happens to X when I bring Y in, right? Now, within that experimental setting, a couple of things that we kind of need to bear in mind as we move forward. One thing is that is it actually Y which is causing X to change? And to really understand that, is it actually Y that is resulting in this change in X? or is somehow related to. Remember, correlation versus causation, right? So whatever the hypothesis is, we want to be sure that we're actually getting what we wanted to get, right? Or what we predicted is actually responsible. The responsibility of our prediction lies with Y and not with anything else. This anything else, what could possibly also create an effect in X, is called a confounding variable. So we account for the confounding variables, and in our research design, a couple of things that we do so that we can sort of amplify the chances for our research design to be such that it holds up or is valid, right, and is reliable. So we check for internal validity, which means to make sure that the research design and the way that the research has been written out, as well as later the forms of analysis presented for your findings, are as bias free as possible. And the other thing we want to make sure is that we can conduct this particular study in a different environment and get the same results, right? So um, the study has to be replicable in an external context, which is different, perhaps. Um, so you kind of need to keep those two things in mind, right? Count for confounding variables and make sure that your research design is reliable. Okay, so these are two things to keep in mind. And then you kind of figure out, well, who am I studying, right? So the who you're studying is this broad, huge, giant population. And obviously, it's not possible for you to do your research on, let's say, like you can't do your research on a group of like 50,000 people necessarily, right? You kind of need to, for the purposes of, let's say, practicability, you have to narrow it down. So you choose a group within the population you want to study, which is called sampling. But again, for your research to be valid and to have more validity externally as well as internally, this sample that you choose has to be representative, meaning that every member of the population has an equal chance of being part of your research sample. So you want to work with that, and that is called well, how you do that is called random sampling, right? And you have to check your sample once also to make sure it's representative, because randomization absolutely will increase the chances that your research sample represents every member of the population, but it's not a guarantee, right? And so you have to make it as representative as possible by checking your sample. Anyway, so that's a summary of what we covered, and it's also right here on this slide. If there's anything that you still don't get, then please write to me with like question, whatever you need. And I'm just gonna look quickly at the chat. In the past, has experimental study results contributed more to psychology as a field, or case study results in terms of usefulness and reliability of results? So I would encourage you to, instead of thinking in terms of like which method is overall the best, think in terms of the particular hypothesis or the particular question that the researcher has, and how well the study method, the research method, fits that hypothesis, right? So it's not as simple as, oh, for example, like experimental methods are the best because, well, it's a completely controlled setting, because even in that control setting, there is a downside, right? You can still have confounding variables introduced in the process. On the flip side, if you were to say, well, I think case studies are the best because they generate a wealth of data. Great, they do generate a wealth of data, but at the end of the day, you have to check your data for what assumptions it's presenting as well, right? If you want to test, for example, the effects of water on a plant, which is that really cute slide that we looked at earlier in our last class, you can do that in an experimental study, but you can also check that using a case study, right? So which one is more efficient to your purpose? A case study where you sit and observe like two plants for 5 years, or 2 weeks or 2 months, or an experimental setting where you're very carefully controlling everything and you're still observing it at the end of the day, right? Except for this particular hypothesis, an experimental setting is better. On the flip side, if I want to, let's say, examine attitudes of racism in the classroom, right, which was the example given for a case study, if I tell people I'm going to look at you for racist attitudes, or if I imply in any way that I'm creating a condition of racism within an experimental setting to see how people respond, number one, there are ethical issues with that. And secondly, how reliable will those results be, right? So you have to ask yourself, what is it? What's the question that you're asking? And absolutely, you should draw data from more than one source, right? Because, which is what Ifra is saying, because so if I'm doing a case study, I can't just look at the classroom. I have to also have surveys, have questionnaires, have in-depth interviews that I can conduct with people, so I know exactly what's happening, right? So that's it. But we have one more slide on research ethics, and then we're going to go on and talk about how your brain works. Very big, but I mean, we're just going to summarize a little bit of the processes responsible for what communication happens in here. Hey, so 1 second. All right. There you go. So, like I said, just I was kind of getting on it. It's a good segue for us is about how I can't create a racist classroom for my study. That's not ethical, right? Why is it not ethical? Because then the people participating in my study and being exposed to those situations are not protected from any potential triggers or any potential trauma that could be induced by participating in the experiment. And so you need to consider the impact on actual human beings. So one of the fundamentals of ethics in psychological research, again, because so much of our psychological research involves experimenting on animals and people, right? And we need to adhere now, thankfully, to control mechanisms or regulatory mechanisms that protect the participants of our research, right? Particularly, so for example, it's not like animals can give consent to participating in a research study, right? We literally just pick them up and we put them in labs. And some of these animal experiments, like in the past, Skinner's experiment with the rats, it was not exactly, it didn't exactly protect the rats involved, right? Because they were getting electric shocks, not ethical. How the rats being protected, right? Or even if you think about Pavlov's dogs, he simulates a hunger response in them, and we learn about this in behaviorism, but he makes them remember that they're hungry, but it's not like he always feeds them, which again is sort of, iffy insofar as the ethics of it are concerned. When we talk about human beings or the protection of human beings, in Milgram's study of obedience, it wasn't Milgram's prison study, okay? It was Zimbardo's prison study, and Milgram did a different one on obedience, where participants had to press a lever to shock someone. And this is a typo on the slide. I'll just fix it. So participants had to shock someone repeatedly if they gave the wrong answer. Participants did not know that the people being shocked weren't actually getting electric shocks, but were actually also just actors. And the purpose of the study was to test how far people would go to obey the rules that are given to them, even when that compromises their own moral integrity, okay? And they found that most people actually went and pressed the shock buttons, and these were incremental shocks. So imagine like the first shock is 50 volts, then 100 volts, 150. And so for every wrong answer, the participant had to shock at a higher current. And the person would obviously, simulate these pain responses in accordance to the level of current. And they found that most people actually did obey the rules, even where they knew that they were shocking someone with, or they thought they were shocking someone with like 400 volts of current. They were uncomfortable with it, but they still did it, right? And in that situation as well, right, if participants, let's say, don't know that they didn't actually shock someone, imagine if there's no debriefing to this trauma, what happens, right? It's not very ethical at all. And then informed consent is another really important procedural element in research that you have to do if you want to publish your study, if you want your study to stand on its own 2 feet, particularly also for reliability, because informed consent implies that you have to tell people what they're signing up for, right? So you don't have to tell them exactly what is going to happen to them, because sometimes that might interfere with your study results. You might, influence your study results in a particular way. So you not necessarily do that, but you do have to tell them what the broader purpose of your study is, and you have to give them the right um, to separate themselves from your study at any point that they are not comfortable anymore with it, right? You have to take informed consent for even something like an interview. So you have to give people the chance to say no at any point in the process, but that also includes the beginning of the process. You tell them what they're signing up for, and when the process is complete, you also have to tell people exactly what they participated in and what the results look like. And if they ever have any questions or they want to withdraw their particular results from your study, participants have the right to do that now. But for most of the research studies that date back to like even up until as recently, I would say, as the 70s or the 80s, these were not fully set in stone, not fully practiced. Isha, with informed consent, participants are never deceived. They're simply given a broad focus of the research study. They're not told what the exact hypothesis is, because that would then lead to biasing your participants towards something. But I don't call it deception. It is still informed consent, because you do tell them, for example, you are participating in my study where I want to gauge how attitudes toward women working, married women working, have changed over the past 20 years. For this study, I am interviewing 20 married women from upper middle class households. As a part of this process, I would also like for you to interview with me. I will be asking you questions about your family, about your home life, about your work life. If at any point you choose or you are not comfortable with proceeding any further, please let me know. If at any point you should have any questions, please ask me. And if at any point you should wish to withdraw your participation, please let me know, right? So it's not exactly deception. You're saying, this is broadly what you're signing up to do. This is what I'm going to be asking you for. If you at any point don't wish to continue with this, let me know. If you're confused about anything I'm saying, let me know. So that's why it's called informed consent, right? Consent implies that you can withdraw consent at any time as well. Important to remember. And yes, you don't tell the exact hypothesis because you don't want to bias your study participants towards actually achieving your hypothesis, because what then happens is the reliability, the internal validity of your study is compromised, right? You don't want that to happen. Also, lastly, as far as research ethics is concerned, we have to account for the influence of our particular social, contextual, cultural values on the hypothesis that is being put forward. So for example, eugenics, which was a field within psychology, and I think I've briefly touched upon it. It's part of psychology's, dark past, which is where the theory was that 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 people are that people of different races inherit inherit particular genetic makeups which put certain races at an advantage where others at a disadvantage, right? So it's biological determinism, which implies that some races are just better and superior to others. So that's one thing. Okay, somebody has raised their hand. Let's see. Can you tell me your name as well, please? I lowered your hand. Ask me, and please tell me your name.
My name is Sadaf. Basically, I was just going to ask.
You're
I wrote
muted,
this.
or I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sadaf.
Okay, so I posted this question in the chat, which was basically then don't ethical guidelines then limit the boundaries of research? And then someone did reply to it saying that the well-being of people or participant is maybe more important than the validity of result. But I don't necessarily agree with that because that's a very subjective point of view.
Okay.
So, what do you think about that? Does it limit research?
What do you feel about this? Because you
I
said,
personally think in some ways it does. I mean, I feel like ethics are important because you do want to protect um like people, and not only just people but even animals. But in some ways it does end up actually like limiting research because you might not be able to find out things that way, even if they're harmful. Information is information.
yeah, you're right. And there is a trade-off. I think that's the term trade-off possibly completely explains what you're referring to. Because when you are focusing on protecting your research participants, there's a trade-off because you're absolutely right. There are limitations then to what you can achieve with research. For example, keeping in mind protection of human beings and protection of animals. If I wanted to study, let's say, the development of psychopathy in young children, and if you don't know, in to diagnose psychopath psycho sorry, to diagnose pathology, one of the things that we look at is like a triangle of behavior. And there are three things in that triangle. One of them is harming animals, right? So
Mhm.
imagine if I said, oh, I want to study psychopathy or the development of psychopathy in children. So I'm going to take these potentially like violent young children and I'm going to give them these animals and put them in lab setting, and I'll give them all sorts of tools, right? So I'll give them like knives and scissors and things like that, and I'll give them food, and then I'll just see what they do with it, right? And those children go ahead and some of them feed the animals, whereas others actually mutilate and harm the animals. I will have, yes, learned something important about psychopathy, but I have, number one, harmed the participants of my study. I have also harmed animals, right? And so, is it more important for me to not harm others or to get my findings, right? That's the trade off. And the trade off is always going to be in favor of protecting the participants. So, you don't want to do that. That's what I would say. I hope that answers your question. All right, there's three people saying things. Ethics refers to whether rules of conduct are necessary when carrying out research. We have a moral responsibility to protect participants from harm. However important the issue under investigation, psychologists remember that they have a duty to respect the rights and dignity of research participants. That's very well put. It was unethical because the notion of consent was implied. I don't know if that Hiba, that's okay. I'm not sure what Sarah is referring to. And then it is not ethical. Studies find funding. Yeah, you don't get funding if your study is not ethical, for sure. You actually have to submit a detailed research protocol whenever you want to work on human subjects to an internal board of review, a research review board, basically. It's called the IRB. And that review board has to review your documentation, your research methodology itself. And only after you get ethical approval from this study, from this board, are you legally allowed to go ahead and conduct the study and then publish the results, right? And no research stands without publication. So the IRB is a really good way now to regulate the what research looks like. Okay, now I'm going to take this one last question and we're going to move forward. You have your hand raised, but I can't see your name. So why don't you go ahead? I lowered your hand. We had someone with their hand raised. I lowered your hand. I don't know what your name was. I can't see it in the participant list. So if you had your hand raised, just speak or not. Okay, well, okay. So the last point that I was getting at was that you have to account for cultural values or social norms influencing the kinds of hypotheses that we have. And a lot of the treatment of gender in psychological research is a really fabulous example of how hypotheses can be culturally informed, right? So, in social culturally, you'll notice that a lot of older studies are completely founded or completely sort of focused on male participants, right? So, for instance, a study on moral reasoning over the lifetime, the research participants, all men. Um, on the flip side, when studying attachment behaviors in infants, the focus is completely on mothers and their children instead of incorporating the assumption that fathers can also be primary caregivers. But that was because both of these studies happened at a time where, number one, the prevalent sort of assumptions were that men have better reasoning abilities, and B, that women are the primary caregivers. And now, fast forward like 70 years later, we realize that actually, no, fathers are also primary caregivers, for example, or that women have exactly the same moral reasoning abilities or just reasoning abilities as men. The difference in the development of those abilities actually is not so much gender, it's environment. It's not biology, it's environment, right? But we know that now, right? And so you have to account for the fact that, like, an evolution has happened in the way that we understand human development as a whole, or what gender is, and that's how we're trying to make psychology more value free. But there'll always be an element of value or norms in the way that a hypothesis is structured. um, Okay, one question. How will we assess the diversity of human behavior? If Milgram would have told the participants the true reason for the experiment, he would never know that humans are capable to go to an extreme length to obey rules. Actually, the reason that Milgram conducted this experiment is because of the war crimes that happened during the Second World War. And he wanted to see, well, what makes humans, not whether humans are capable of going to such extremes. His question was what makes them adhere to these instructions even when they conflict with their personal values. And I'm not so sure that studying this sort of breakdown in your personal moral code as you obey instructions gives you an answer to the what. It shows you a yes or no, of course, but does it really answer the what? I'm not so sure. So you kind of, think about that. All right, now we go on to our next bit, which is the brain, like I mentioned earlier. So it's the interaction between your brain and the environment, and basically, how do you receive information? How do you make sense of that information? What happens really inside your brain that sometimes makes you feel certain ways, or can, let's say, lead to a physical response of some kind? So, what really happens, right? Um, Biopsychology, it infers that the way you think, your mental life is very much connected to your physiological or your biological life, right? So it's not like, imagine this, it's not like, there's this universe of thought, where all these thoughts just freely float around and you pick and choose and you kind of think, and it's like this lovely philosophical, you know, mind. That's not exactly what it is. Actually, the way that you think, what happens is all about neural networks inside your brain, and the brain itself is constructed in a manner where, and now we understand this, where different structures or different pieces within the brain are responsible for one or more tasks. Okay, and so assume parts A, B, C, D, E of the brain. Each of them have a particular unique function. But in performing that function, part A perhaps connects with part D connects with part F connects with part E, and so there's this web, right? There's this complete network. And obviously, when I say connect, what I'm trying to imply is that all the different parts of your brain are communicating with each other at any given point in time. So that's the first thing. Our brain, the structures of our brain are in constant communication with each other. Our brain is a wonderful thing. It's capable of performing multiple processes at the same time. We know that. The second thing we know about our brain is that our brain is adaptive. Okay. And by adaptive, remember this communication between the different parts of the brain that happens at the speed of light, right? That you're not even conscious of. So, for example, right now I'm speaking to you and my hands are moving. It's not a conscious movement, it's just happening quite automatically. I'm not thinking about it, right? What I'm thinking about, rather more consciously, is what I'm saying. But while I'm saying these words to you in lecture, I'm also making sure that I'm following the flow of the slide. So I'm partially reading as well as speaking, as well as trying to help you learn. So there's three conscious mental processes I'm performing. At the same time, I just very unconsciously, I promise, not planned, did this to signify three, right? So my motor skills are working at the same time as my speech, as my visual, as well as my listening. So I know that I'm coherent. So take all of that together, okay? And that means my brain is adaptive. My brain is able to deal with changing situations. Somebody just entered the waiting room, and while I'm talking to you, I'm able to press admit, right? I'm adapting to the changing situation, very micro level. Second thing is that our brain is very plastic. So as you go through life, whatever you're experiencing, it leaves impressions, very real physiological impressions on your brain. So, for instance, when you're born, when you're 0 years old, and this is what we're going to do when we do human development, when you're 0 years old, you have maybe like your neural networks, they maybe look like, let me show you on the slide. When you're like zero years old, this is probably what your neural networks look like. Okay? By the time you're 3 years old, this is what your neural networks look like. They multiply incrementally by the time you turn 3. And these are physical changes in your brain. These are actual networks, okay? They're actual networks. So remember this, the brain is highly plastic. Okay, so your chat is exploding. Let me just deal with that first. You're still talking about Milgram. You're fine. Yes, you're right. There's no IRB. People cannot consciously change their genes. I don't know what that means. Yeah, okay. Can you move a little bit now to what we're actually studying? I love that you're having these questions, but move with the class, please. Does the neural network keep on developing and increasing? Yes, it can either increase in complexity and density or degenerate. It depends on your experiences, right? Remember, plasticity. And the brain also engages in a process called pruning, where neural networks that you haven't used for a long time are pruned, meaning the brain just gets rid of them so you can form newer connections. Again, this is part of the plasticity of your brain. So yeah, you're right. Okay. Last part about the brain, and this is related to, well, genetics as well as the environment. But when we talk about our psychological processes, our thinking, our emotions, our responses, our behaviors, we can't talk about our behaviors, our thinking, our attitudes, our feelings without talking about our genetic composition. Okay. Meaning the actual information that is pre-coded into us, which in turn interacts with the environment, influencing the expression of particular genes. And we talked about this very briefly in our last class as well, if I'm not mistaken, or perhaps it was the class before, where we talked about the impact of genetics on our behaviors, our thinking, etc., etc. And we found that, okay, so for example, depression has a very high genetic component, meaning that that depression is transferred genetically. Clinical depression is transferred genetically. We know this. And somebody said, maybe it was in class participation or an email, but somebody said that, women are more likely to develop depression, and this has been found through genetic studies, right? But what you also need to think about is that, does the world create conditions whereby women are exposed to situations more likely to give rise to that first incidence of depression? Yes or no? So think about that, right? Environment. Second thing is, do we simply identify depression more in women because that's where we're looking for it? This is related to what I was saying to you earlier about culture and society influencing our hypotheses. And the third thing you think about is that, do you just identify depression in women more because culturally the way women are brought up is to talk more about their emotions, whereas is depression simply underreported in men, right? And so perhaps the gene is being expressed, but the way depression looks in men and women can be completely different as well. So you have to think about those things, right? But again, at the end of the day, depression, let's just go with that example. There is a genetic component to it, but does that mean that depression just gets just happens to you regardless, right? Are we going with biological determinism here? What we actually know is that experiences in life contribute to the expression of genes. So if you're born with that depression gene, your life experiences can trigger that gene to be expressed, right? And once that happens, the second thing that's going to happen to you is that particular neurotransmitters will be inhibited from being released in your brain. Neurotransmitters are chemicals in our brains. I'm going to look at these contributions to class. There's habit, get into genes. The jury is still out on that. Same way as the jury is still out on collective trauma transmission. We know it happens, but the how is so difficult to figure out that they're still working on it. Toxic masculine, yes, okay. If you have mental disorders, any precautions you can take, or is it inevitable for your child? It is never inevitable. That's what I'm getting at. It's about experience, right? It's about experience. It's about cultural context. It's about available support systems. It's about internal resilience, which has some genetic component, but also an external environmental component. It's about so many complex factors that, remember, when you talk about something as sensitive as mental illness, you will never find a simple, clear cut, yes, this is how it is for every single person sort of an answer, because it's not possible, right? Yes, we know that certain patterns exist that allow us to classify particular disorders as, let's say, mood disorders or thought disorders, whatever. But we can't make these sort of tall claims about something like mental illness. It's too sensitive, and again, unless you have experienced a mental illness yourself, you can't really speak as to what the experience of mental illness is. That's part of, I would say, almost a research ethics, where you don't patronize your participants. All right, I'm gonna ask you to pause on your chat now, please, because you do have to learn other things that actually were meant for you to learn today. You have great questions. Keep them for when we talk about mental illness in detail, which we will do in a few weeks. And by that time, I think some of your questions will also be answered. Yes, somebody was saying something.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. What's your name? Because I can't see you.
Vanya.
Okay.
Vanya. Yeah, I'm sorry, my videos of my Wi-Fi is acting weird. But okay, so I don't know if you mentioned this before, but is biopsychology somewhat related to evolutionary psychology? Because they're talking about the changing in behaviors and modifications in neural networks and stuff. Is that somewhat
Yes.
related?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Biopsychology is the intersection of biology and psychology. So all of it, right? Genetics plus hormonal processes plus your neural networks and their interaction with the world, the physical, actual world around you and the people you encounter, all of that is absolutely, you're right. That's biopsychology. Is that what you were asking? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I was. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Mm, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So this really pretty diagram, which is also in your textbook, sort of just simply, very simply explains what happens in your brain when you encounter information. Okay. Now I'm using information to talk about any sort of stimuli that you're exposed to. Information, for example, could be a painting that you see. It could be reading a piece of text. It could be just you're looking out your window and the sunlight hits your face. Even that's information, right? And this information, therefore, is an external stimulus. But not all information will cause you to respond consciously. And not all information will even get a response. So for instance, I'm teaching you right now, and I'm looking at my screen. And this is obviously something that I would refer to as a threshold, right? As an external stimulus that is actually causing certain responses to go off in my brain. Now, while the screen is that external stimulus for me, until this moment where I'm telling you about what's around the screen, right? So there's, for instance, this little plant, there's this little like calendar, there's this stationery jar, little post-its, whatever. All of this stuff that's around me is not currently causing, until I said that, oh, these are these things, there was no actual response happening. They were just part of the background environment, right? The external threshold was precisely just this screen. Now, what happens is when an external threshold is met, right? When something external and an external stimulus enters your awareness, you're going to respond in a particular way. The brain receives that information. In response to that information, and that again, that information is an external stimulus that has reached the threshold for an actual response. And that external stimulus meets the threshold, your nerve cells are activated. Those nerve cells, we call them neurons. Neurons, i.e., neural networks. I think you can now see that connection. Those neurons are basically inactive until that external stimulus fired or causes it to fire off. Okay. When the nerve cell fires off, what it's doing is it's sending that information to a different nerve cell, which then sends it to a different neuron, which sends it to a different neuron, and so on and so forth. When that process is happening, You can see on your screens exactly how it happens, that these are very real physical structures. There is a nerve cell. That nerve cell does have an axon attached to it, and the axon is what passes the information on, right? And there is a myelin sheath that covers the tip of some of the axons of neurons, and the myelin sheath helps to create a faster response between neural impulses. And then there are these actual physically existing very real branches, and those branches are called terminal branches, and they form connection points or meeting points with other nerve cells, which then, using their dendrites, which you can see on the left side, receive messages and transfer them onto yet another nerve cell. And so this is what communication looks like in your brain, except it happens so fast that you're not even fully conscious of it. So take one moment and just look at this. And I'm going to see if you have put anything in chat. No, you haven't. Just look at this. It's literally like point A is a nerve cell or the neuron. And once that neuron has reason to become activated, what it does is it fires off information using the axon. And the axon then, through the dendrites, is able to pass on messages to other neurons sorry, to other neurons. And so that all of this is happening, it's happening super fast, and it's happening completely mostly unconsciously. uh, and and this is how different parts of your brain communicate with each other, and this is how they are able to help you do anything, really, from raising your hand to tying your shoelaces to brushing your hair, washing your face, getting angry, getting sad, being happy. All of that is coming from your neural networks and how they communicate with each other. Okay, somebody had raised their hand. I'm going to ask you, please, to speak. I can't see your name right now, so if you could just lower your hand and just share whatever it was. Naval.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so this might be a silly question. I just wanted to know that you said that through this whole process, we get our responses, right? We know how to respond. So, do defense and coping mechanisms work in the same way?
You
So, through
okay?
this network, we are provided by ways to cope, right? Or is there different like process in that also?
Okay. So defense mechanisms are defined slightly differently, because those are something that those are identified by Freud, and there is no real evidence as to whether these defense mechanisms, such as projection or deflection, actually exist. Um, but on the flip side, coping mechanisms are very, very real. So for example, if you have anxiety disorder, then your coping mechanism might be to take deep breaths when you're feeling the onset of panic attack. Now, that absolutely exists very much physically in your brain, but it's not something you are born with. It's something you are taught. Okay. It's something you are taught. However, what it looks like in operation, right? When you're taking those deep breaths, as an example of a coping mechanism, number one, somebody taught you to do it. Okay. But secondly, when you're actually doing it, the way it works to calm your anxiety is by asking your neural networks to slow down. Okay, it shifts the focus away from all that super fast firing in your brain that happens when you have a panic attack, and it forces your brain to focus on just breathing, right? So that's how a coping mechanism physiologically also helps. Does that answer your question?
Yes, so can we say that for different coping mechanisms, our brain and these neural networks work in different ways?
Yes,
Okay,
completely.
thank you.
Absolutely. Journaling, for example, is also a coping mechanism. But writing things you're grateful for in your journal sets off very different responses in your brain as opposed to doing deep breathing, right? Or meditation. So, yes. Vanya's question, therapy such as CBT, focus on making the person aware of their neural networks, shifting focus from one thing to another. It's not about neural networks, it's more about set pathways in the mind. So for example, when you use CBT with somebody who has depression, what you teach that person to do is, okay, so you think you can't talk to anybody because nobody will speak back to you. So today, maybe go to the grocery store and say hello to someone and see what that looks like. So you don't essentially make someone aware of their neural networks. You kind of highlight their negative cognitions, and you help them overcome those by actual behaviors that show them that their beliefs are false or their assumptions are not true. A coping mechanism is not fight or flight. Fight or flight is a built-in response. It is something that is an actual physiological, real defense mechanism that's built into us, which is what an evolutionary psychologist would say. That fight or flight has helped us survive millennia, and that's why it's hardwired into us. And I would call it absolutely a defense mechanism, but not at all in a Freudian way. So now you understand that all this communication happens between all these nerve cells, these neurons in your brain, resulting in the formation of these neural networks. So even when you, for example, remember something that you learned in 5th grade, the reason it'll take you longer is because maybe that neural network hasn't been used in a long time. But if I ask you to remember what you learned in the last class, some stuff might stick out to you because it was so recent and that neural network is still in formation. And the reason, one, I can tell you, is that we begin every class by saying, oh, okay, so this is what we did in our last class, is so that that network or that pathway becomes more reinforced and becomes stronger. I don't really think hypnosis is a real thing, so I'm not going to be able to answer your question, Ifra. I have not studied hypnosis at all. I don't think it is real. So when you can't remember the axon is at rest, no. When you can't remember something, that means that the information was either stored so long ago in your memory that the encoding and the actual information just is further back, or that when the actual information you were trying to remember it, when the information was received and encoded, it was never put in your long-term memory, it remained in your short-term memory. And when we study memory, you'll learn this as well. Okay, neurotransmitters. So chemicals that create responses. That's what a neurotransmitter is. There are different types of neurotransmitters. This example here is again related to depression. I'm going to close the chat now. So this example here is related to depression. Okay, it's talking about what happens when you have a medication for depression. The medication is called Prozac. Prozac is a very popular, very widely used antidepressant. It's used in the treatment of depression. It is a mood regulating drug, meaning that it helps you stabilize your mood so you don't spiral completely into depressive states of mind, where everything, by the way, the word depression itself implies that your responses become depressed. When something becomes depressed, it means it's not as active. So you kind of need to remember that. When you are taking Prozac, step one, that information is sent across the synaptic gap. One thing that I didn't mention in previous slide, I'm sorry, is that there's a small gap between nerve endings, which is called the synapse. And the synapse is where information is sent, but the synapse also has a particular function. The synapse will make neurotransmitters stay in the gap for a particular time. Okay, I'm gonna again ask you, I'll repeat my request to you to please stop using the chat right now and pay attention on what I'm saying. So in the synapse, you have neurotransmitters that stay. I'm gonna have to deactivate the chat for this class. I don't know how many times I need to say this. So, step number three is that what happens when you take the Prozac is that it prevents your happy neurotransmitters, your serotonin, from being reabsorbed just as fast. Okay, so it helps you maintain an equilibrium or a happier, let's say, state of mind for a longer time, instead of just losing all that serotonin, which is what happens when you're depressed. You have a lack of serotonin because serotonin reuptake happens so fast that you don't actually, it doesn't stay in the synapse for long enough to be used by you, essentially, in a very basic way. That's what it looks like. And now let me see what you said. Chocolate has sugar, which helps release serotonin. Sugar releases dopamine, actually, I think. Caffeine also releases dopamine. And dopamine are your reward centers. Stimulate certain hormones. We have to remember something by a situation, how the brain is considered responses with the brain. How the brain has conditioned responses where the brain relates normal neutral stimuli to result in a similar response is also really interesting. Yes, it is very interesting. And in the question about how food affects your emotions, it also depends on your particular associations with food. That's important to account for, particularly, when you talk about things like eating disorders. A lot of that is your associations or the messaging that you have associated with particular stimuli, which is, I think, what somebody else was just saying about how particular different stimuli can have differing effects. And your brain can become conditioned to something, right? So for example, a taste aversion, which is where, or a food aversion, which is where you eat something and maybe you get sick. And as a result of that, you will always avoid eating it again. That's an example. Are neurotransmitters hormones, or are they a classification of their own? They are very much a classification of their own. Some neurotransmitters are also hormones. It's confusing. But yeah, hormones exist within you as well, but like some neurotransmitters, some chemical messengers are also hormones. But for our purposes, we're not talking about those. We're just talking about pure like chemicals, pure neurotransmitters. And now I'm going to tell you about some different neurotransmitters and why they're important. Some of these you might be familiar with. We were actually just talking about these, right? Serotonin or pleasure, endorphins. So is this how all antidepressants work? Is this how something like sertraline works? It depends on the chemical composition, but essentially most antidepressants are called SSRIs, which means the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So something like sertraline, I'm not sure what the specific chemical compound is, so I don't know. But if it is an SSRI, then it will work like Prozac. Okay. Now talk about, again, I think this is very important because you were just asking that question as well about the relationship of hormones and neurotransmitters. So these are particular neurotransmitters. They're very broadly responsible for particular sort of reactions. So adrenaline is fight or flight. Somebody just asked whether our fight or flight response is something that exists, that is, what was your, somebody said something about fight or flight response. I forget what they had said. But anyway, so each chemical messenger is responsible for some sort of reaction that's happening, right? So the sugar example, the sugar example, for example. Dopamine, yes, but sugar could also release noradrenaline. I don't know, I have to look into it, but I'm just giving you an example right now. When you do things that create certain sort of, let's say, pleasant emotions within you, that can be endorphins and dopamine working together. So if you like to, let's say, if you exercise, one of the most common examples of endorphin release is called the runner's high. So if you like to go running, you'll find most people who run, right, for exercise will tell you that it's very addictive. So there's something, I don't know if any of you exercise regularly, and you should, because you're young and something you should do. But working out is probably the healthiest sort of coping mechanism, actually, because it releases all these endorphins in you, it releases dopamine in you as well, and adrenaline, which just gives you some excitement and some energy as well. But these are all very healthy neurotransmitters when you receive them through a healthy source, right? Like exercise. And they give rise to particular states of mood. So that phrase I was using, runner's high, when people engage in an intense sort of physical activity like running, or at the gym you lift weights, whatever, you release endorphins which help you feel better, and your mood becomes altered. Actually, your mood becomes better. And by better, right now, it's a value loaded term. What I mean is that qualitatively, you feel happier, you feel almost euphoric, you'll have a lot of energy, surprisingly, after you work out, even if you didn't before when you started. Adrenaline is not released in emergency situations only. No. Adrenaline can be released in any situation where you're excited. Endorphins are partially, yes, natural painkillers. It's very good because and this is a problem actually, where a lot of people who run, this is, I can tell you that this is a part I've read, a lot of people who go running a lot of athletes who train really hard often develop a lot of injuries that they don't even feel, and they continue despite those injuries because of the endorphins, which are basically numbing all the pain. So that's a good point. GABA is also related to pain relief, GABA, because again, it calms you. So it's related to pain management as well. Is there a difference in the way dopamine, endorphins, and serotonin affect you? Or do all of them simply evoke positive emotions? They invoke positive feelings, yes, but it depends on exactly I mean, again, this is one of those like yes, no questions I can't answer. Because if you have too much serotonin, you're going to be in a manic state. If you have too many endorphins, you're going to be in a manic state. That's not good for you. But dopamine is also released by like you getting, likes on social media. At the same time, you could also get dopamine just by eating something sweet. So yeah, Ramin is right. Depends on the source of release. And also the amount is a big factor in how strong the influence is, right? So let's say if you, okay, contextualize the information. If you're running for the first time in your life, I'm going to stay with that example right now, okay? If you're going running for the first time in your life and you've never really been a physically fit person, do you think that you're going to be having some sort of endorphin release at the end of your, let's say, first day running? No, you're going to want to die. Okay, no endorphins will be released. Fast forward a month or 2 months later, yes, you're going to start feeling those endorphins, because first of all, your body is just taking some time to deal with that physical change. So you have to account for context. You're not accounting for context. Now, when we talk about, also another important thing, when we talk about neurotransmitters, we also need to consider some of them are also artificial. Okay, so you can introduce artificial neurotransmitters. So our little Prozac is an artificial neurotransmitter that's being introduced, or any kind of opiate is an artificial neurotransmitter. What it does is it blocks reuptake, right? It blocks, let's say, particular neurotransmitter from being transmitted further. And so it stays in the circuit, that neurotransmitter. Our diet affects also, yes, it does affect how neurotransmitters are produced. And then certain neurotransmitters are antagonists, meaning that they will increase the level of the neurotransmitter itself, but they'll decrease action or production. It's a little confusing. Also running for the first time as a generally, yes, it doesn't. Okay. So anyway, just as far as neurotransmitters are concerned, remember this: they are part of what helps us survive, absolutely. But in excess or in extreme deficiency, they prevent us from functioning adaptively. Okay, so for instance, if you're walking around with a surfeit of endorphins, it's going to be in a euphoric state of mind. It's going to be very difficult to figure out what reality is, right? Or on the flip side, if you're depressed and you're not producing enough serotonin, then it's going to again have a very massive impact on your perception of reality as well as your responses to reality. And yes, SSRIs are agonists. Okay, so remember that particular chemical messengers are responsible for particular responses, and excess levels of dopamine, excess of anything, right? Your brain is a fine-tuned machine, it has to be balanced. So yes. Okay, and now a little bit more, and this might make sense if you think about what I was telling you earlier about when I'm talking to you, I'm also moving my hands, I'm also like reading, but I'm also talking, and I'm also trying to make sense, and I'm also reading your chat and all of this, right? And so for instance, from time to time, you notice that I ask you to stop messaging on this chat. The reason is because it becomes maybe cognitive overload for me to read the chat, read the slide, teach you, make sure I'm making sense in what I'm teaching you. It's a bit much, right? Because I'm not just reading the chat, I'm also processing the questions that you're asking. And so my concentration gets disrupted. That's why from time to time, I'm like, okay, pause. So when we talk about the nervous system, we're talking about the brain, and partially also about like some parts outside of the brain that are just physiological. And I do ask you to excuse my poor biological knowledge a little bit at this point, but the nervous system that we are concerned with mostly is the central nervous system, but at the same time, we can't talk about the central nervous system without talking about the peripheral nervous system, because they both work really closely together. Now, I want you to look at this green line. You see it? The central nervous system. This is the brain. This is the spinal cord, right? However, in the peripheral nervous system, what you see in the orange, all of these, right? All of these nerves or veins or lines in the peripheral nervous system, are they linked to the brain and the spinal cord? Yes, right? The connections are very strong, and these two systems rely on each other. So central, peripheral. Central is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves around the brain and the spinal cord. When we talk about the peripheral nervous system, we're talking about two things. We're talking about the autonomic nervous system, and we're talking about the somatic nervous system. So it's called ANS and CNS. When we talk about ANS first, it says on the slide, controls self-regulated action of internal organs and glands. In simple language, what this means is, let's talk a little bit about adrenaline. When you experience adrenaline or a rush of adrenaline, it jolts your peripheral nervous system into action. Okay? It jolts your peripheral nervous system into action, whereby the sympathetic nervous system is activated. And when you have that rush of adrenaline, you will maybe start moving, right? Your body, like you physically feel more energized when you do things. On the flip side, if it is your parasympathetic nervous system that is activated, for instance, when we do deep breathing, that's what happens. Your parasympathetic nervous system is activated when you do that deep breathing. And the messaging sent back to your central nervous system is to calm down, right? And the somatic nervous system is also activated at both times, whether you're talking about a sympathetic response or parasympathetic response. So if it's an arousal response or a sympathetic response, what happens is that, you have this rush of adrenaline and you're like, okay, if you've ever gone to any kind of cricket match, football match, some sort of sports match, right? Imagine what happens when somebody strikes a goal or hits a six or whatever. People go crazy, right? People jump around, they're clapping their hands and this and that. There's a lot of adrenaline, right? The sympathetic nervous system has been aroused. Now, after that, immediately after that, the person who's made the goal or scored the six is out. Okay, there is literally, in the supporters of the crowd, you can see a deflation happening. Everybody just says, have you heard that collective, like, oh, like, oh no sound coming from a crowd at a game anywhere? That's a parasympathetic system calming you down, right? At the same time, your physical actions also change, right? Is this making sense to you? Now I'm going to check the chat to see. People report feeling excited or happy during an adrenaline rush. Does adrenaline also release a happy hormone, or do people just mistake their adrenaline feelings for happiness? This is such a great question, because excitement is absolutely natural to an adrenaline rush, but happiness can also be part of an adrenaline rush. So, for instance, let's say if you are the person who is actually on the field scoring that goal, aren't you gonna feel this euphoric joy? At the same time, part of that euphoric joy is also coming from endorphins because of your physical activity, right? And then once you've scored that goal, your teammates come and they give you a hug. What's that? That's further releasing oxytocin. And so that again would happen. Reflexes, Sana, that's a good question. Reflex actions are in your peripheral nervous system. They come from both the ANS and the SNS, which right now I am using to refer to somatic nervous system. I think the mechanism is somehow like how people experiencing anxiety confuse it with a form of excitement. Anxiety is a form of excitement, whereby excitement is not defined as a happy feeling. Excitement refers to the over arousal and overstimulation of your brain and your body. But I don't think that if you ever have anxiety, you can confuse it with feeling excited. As somebody who has anxiety disorder, I can tell you it never feels like excitement. You know that something's wrong. All right. Now, a little bit more about the brain. And then I think we're going to stop today, not because of you guys, but because it's 9:48. And I know you have another class. So just this is very simple, just bear with me. This slide will be uploaded so you can access it later, but just remember this. You know, I was talking about different structures in the brain that communicate with each other and then help us kind of function. Left hemisphere, right hemisphere, most basic, okay? Left side of the brain, right side of the brain, they are connected. They're connected to each other. By what? By the stem. Brain stem connects the two hemispheres. What is that called? It's called the corpus callosum. And within the corpus callosum, around the corpus callosum, this sphere of the brain, this part here is the cerebral cortex. What happens in the cerebral cortex? Communication, information, everything. It's like the mainframe computer, right? At the same time, some other parts of the brain that are also, by the way, some of these are like the oldest known parts of the brain. The amygdala, which is related to your feeling and labeling of emotion. The hippocampus, which is related to your long-term memory. And that's actually where you are supposedly going to retrieve information from when you're trying to remember it. Your pituitary glands, which is basically where all of this, like your and adrenaline, for example, is coming from your pituitary gland. You also have the spinal cord, which I think, as we all know now, is responsible for us being able to move at all. Remember this, it's the spinal cord, central nervous system, right? It's here. And without the spinal cord functioning, none of this, all of these motor output control skeletal muscles, this would not be possible. And the cerebellum, which is where you learn to balance and it helps you learn. It is responsible also for memory and so on and so forth. So that's a little bit about the brain. Gonna stop now and we'll pick up from here in our next class as well. All right. So you have a couple of chat, dopamine, reward chemical, stimulus different. Sorry, I'm just. The somatic one is physical because it's absolutely related to your skeletal movements. But remember, they work together. Okay, so while you're doing that deep breathing to calm your responses, you also need to stay still. You can't possibly do like deep breathing while you're jumping up and down, right? So there is absolutely like this somatic system element involved. Okay, guys. Hopefully, I'll see you in person on Wednesday. And if not, I'll let you know by tomorrow afternoon, depending on how I'm feeling. I think this is probably just a flu, but I can't take chances. So I'll let you know. All right. Okay. Bye-bye. Take care. Thank you.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I need to talk to you for just 2 minutes after class, if that is possible.
Yeah, sure. So if everybody could just leave and then we can talk. Safa, can you, if you don't have a class right now, can you stay back as well, please?
Ma'am, I do have a class, but I'm staying back because it's in a while.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Aisha, Safa is going to be
Okay.
here for, which section is it? 3.9 or 3.8?
I'm sorry, I'll just check. I think it's 3.8.
Okay, Aisha, what's your section?
I don't know. I haven't checked. Like.
Okay, no.
No, mine
I
is
don't know.
3.9.
I'm sorry.
50239.
Okay, ठीक है.
So Aisha, yours would be a 50238.
Okay.
Maybe.
I think I'm just gonna kick these people out, and maybe Safa, you can remember their names, because I think maybe they're not like really paying attention to class itself, and that's why they don't
Okay.
leave. So Ikra, Jamil, Shahan, Majid, Amna, Arif, Hania, Farag. This child, Shahan, sorry, I should stop recording right now.